Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. Where we once sang sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us, in response to being taunted and insulted, this idiom, like so many other childhood memories, turned out to be untrue. The words we use have taken on a deeper significance, and they can be extremely hurtful and painful. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is the name of this new podcast series, and it's part of my dissertation project as we explore the cause and effect of polarization, the words we use, and how to navigate difficult conversations, whether about climate, race, gender, culture, politics, or social justice issues. In this episode, we're joined by Naomi Oreskes. Naomi is a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard. She spent 15 years as a professor of history and science studies at the University of California and was an adjunct professor of geosciences at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Her research focuses on the earth and environmental sciences, with a particular interest in understanding scientific consensus and dissent. Naomi is the author and co-author of 9 books and over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces. I was fortunate to have a conversation with her in 2017 when the world seemed a kinder and gentler place. I was working on my master's and writing about the science of climate change and the many faces of denial. I was struck by her introduction to Pope Francis's The Encyclical on Climate Change and Inequality, and by her other books, Merchants of Doubt and The Collapse of Western Civilization. As I reflect on that conversation, it seems more timely and urgent than ever to consider what individual action looks like for each of us and the role that local and federal governments play. And I suppose because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the big myth, we'll talk about the impact the business has had on all of us. Once again, I'm excited to learn how we can change the world one conversation at a time, and I'm really glad you're here. Let's get started. Hi, Naomi. It's good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, well, we did this after Merchants of Doubt came out, I think. Is that it?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, you had just written the foreword to the encyclical with Pope Francis, and I was just finishing up my master's.
Well, you're finishing your PhD. That's good.
I'm trying to. It's a challenge. But no, it's really nice to see you and catch up. I really appreciate your time. So let me try my questions on for size.
Sure.
The challenge I have is I'm trying to accomplish 2 things. I want to know more about you, and I want to know more about the new book. And I'm trying to find the intersections between the big myth and my research questions. And I think in many ways they intersect. I recall you saying that one of the hopes that you and Eric had about the new book was that it would open up more conversations and more people would start talking. And everything that I've been trying to accomplish in my research about polarization is to understand the cause and effect and how it impacts the conversations we have. So I'm really curious how we can put all this together. So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what called you to teach or become a professor, why you do what you do?
Not at all. Sure, I'm happy to do that. Okay. Well, so as you know, I'm a professor. I'm an academic. I teach the history of science at Harvard, and I also am an affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences. My own career path came through earth science. I studied science as an undergraduate. I worked as a mining and exploration geologist for a few years after I graduated. And then I went back to university to get a PhD in what I thought would be geology, thinking I would be a geology professor. I loved the earth. I loved being outdoors. I loved camping. And so geology was this fun, interesting field where you learned about the earth and you also got to go camping. And almost every geologist I know felt kind of that way about it. So there was a real fellowship, a real bond among fellow geologists. But I also always had a lot of other interests. I liked to read. I read a lot of fiction. I was interested in history and politics, and I always felt like those were things I was supposed to shove aside in order to be a scientist. And one day in graduate school, I decided to take a class in philosophy of science, just out of interest, to be a well-rounded human being. And it turned out, although it was advertised as a philosophy class, it was actually a course in history of science. And that was my eureka moment when I discovered there was actually a field, an academic field, where you could earn a living and be paid to think about science in its broader social context. And that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since.
And that's why the title, Professor of the History of Science, which is so cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's my job title, History of or the history of science. So yes, I consider myself a historian now.
What are some of the biggest challenges you faced, and how have you overcome them?
Well, challenges function on lots of different levels. On one level, the biggest challenge has just been, being a serious intellectual and academic, and also being a wife and a mother and a dog owner, and just, keeping all the parts of my whole life together. I think all serious people, whether they're academics, artists, journalists, whatever, the challenge of having a whole life is a big one, especially in our highly competitive North American society. So I think in a way that's been the most important thing for me over the years, is finding that right balance between being a public figure, a public intellectual, an author of books, a person who does interviews like this, but also being there for my family, my friends, and my children, of course, and my dog. And I guess, though, on an intellectual level, I guess for me, I feel like the deepest challenge is it's not the attacks. It's not that ExxonMobil calls me names or that I get hate mail. I know a lot of times people want to talk about that. I don't know, there's some kind of weird vicarious thrill or something. That's not really the biggest issue. For me, the biggest issue is just how hard this issue really is, because climate change is already doing huge amounts of damage. People are dying. People died in the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest last year, 2 years ago now, I guess. People have had their homes destroyed, their communities burnt. It's a really dark topic. And when you really sit with it, and you sit with the fact that there are people whose activities are destroying the lives of other people, and they don't seem to care, they don't seem to mind, that in a way is the hardest thing for me, because I feel like, and maybe I'm feeling this especially the last few weeks after all of what's been going on in the world, but there's tremendous good in human beings, but there's also tremendous evil. And I feel like the last few weeks, we've really looked into the heart of darkness of humanity. And in a way, my work is like that too. And I don't often speak of it in those terms because it sounds melodramatic. But ultimately, that's kind of what's going on, right? It's like when Eric Conway and I did the work on the history of tobacco, and people said to us, how did those guys sleep at night, right? And there is a way in which this whole project has that element, that we study people who are knowingly hurting other people, and just they keep on doing it. And they do it deliberately, they do it consciously, they do it for profit. And that's sometimes hard to sit with, the reality that people could be that evil. And then also because sometimes your audience doesn't want to hear that. They don't want to believe that the fossil fuel industry is evil. They don't like the word evil. They want you to talk in blander language. And I think for a long time, I tried to honor that in terms of understanding that talking about good and evil is a really, really hard thing to do. But in the last few years, I felt increasingly like we have to have that conversation. And that's hard.
You're the author or co-author of 9 books, over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces. The last time we talked, it was pre-COVID, and here we are in 2023 with your new book, The Big Myth. And I want to get to the big myth, but I want to know what's changed for you in class.
Well, I think the biggest thing that's changed in class is that my students are really critical of capitalism now. So 10 years ago, if I started talking about climate change as a market failure, my students were not that open to that conversation. They really wanted to believe that capitalism was the best of all possible systems and we could trust markets. I mean, this is partly what has led to the new book, how much our colleagues, people we knew, our neighbors, and our students believed that if you just left things to the wisdom of the marketplace, the magic of the marketplace, things would be sorted. And so therefore, and we talk about this in the new book, right? The idea that government should just get out of the way and let markets do their magic. A lot of my students thought that 10 years ago. I feel like almost none of my students feel that now. And they're very eager to have a conversation about capitalism. And they're very eager to have a conversation about what the alternatives to our current, capitalism run amok system could be.
So that's refreshing. That's got to be fun.
Yeah, it is fun. I mean, in a way, it's fun too, because I used to feel like I was to the left of my students, and now I feel like I'm to the right of them, which I guess is a natural evolution. But it is sort of fun. I kind of, in a way, prefer being to the right of them in some weird way. I don't know why, but yeah,
well, it feels it's got to be challenging. That's a fun challenge.
It is. It is a fun challenge. And it's interesting to think also about why they have a more critical view of capitalism than my students did 10 years ago.
So Let's talk about the book. What was the drive? What is the big myth?
Well, the drive was to answer the question that was left unanswered at the end of Merchants of Doubt. So all good research answers some questions and opens up new ones. So in Merchants of Doubt, we wanted to understand why intelligent, educated people would reject hard-won scientific evidence, not just about climate change, but about the harms of tobacco, the reality of acid rain, because the story we told there was of a group of people who had fought the scientific evidence on a whole set of different issues, all of which were really well established scientifically. And climate change was sort of the mother of all the big issues because it was the biggest, and because unlike the other issues in the story, the other issues were all more or less resolved, but climate change was still sort of an ongoing contested issue. So the answer that we found through our research was their political ideology, and specifically the ideology of market fundamentalism, that the particular people we were studying, who were sort of the original climate change deniers in the United States going back to 1989, that they were cold warriors, and they feared that regulation, the government regulation, the marketplace was a backdoor to communism. And so that even though we had won the Cold War, we would somehow in the end lose it through the backdoor of government regulation, the marketplace. And the reason they feared this is because they subscribed to an ideology that held not just that markets are an efficient means of an efficient means of delivering goods and services, but that markets protect political freedom, that economic freedom protects political freedom. And when we finished that book, we recognized that the arguments they were making were similar to the arguments that Friedrich von Hayek made in his 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom. But we felt like we'd already done enough work. The book was long enough. We'd answered the question we set out to answer, and our editor was banging on the door asking for the book. And it felt time sensitive because, climate change in 2010, there was this really big issue about what we were going to do about climate change and were we really going to move forward or not. So it felt important to finish that book and move on. So we finished the book, we answered the question we set out to answer, but it obviously left us with a big new question was, well, why did they believe that? Especially because you don't have to know a lot about history, particularly the history of the 20th century, to know that that idea is just wrong. There's just so much evidence from history to suggest that at best it's a gross oversimplification, and at worst it's just wrong. And so we sort of put a pin in it, and we thought, well, first of all, after Merchants of Doubt was over, we did our laundry, and then we recovered, and then we ended up, and we wrote another book, The Collapse of Western Civilization. Eric and I both had academic books we were working on that we needed to finish. We made a movie. So we did a lot of other things, but we thought we would write another book about technology, because what we also saw at the end of writing Merchants of Doubt was the people we were writing about, and many climate change deniers or people who were skeptical about climate science thought we don't really need to do anything about it because technology will fix it. And we even coined a new word in The Collapse of Western Civilization. We coined the term techno-fideist to refer to faith in technology, right? That these people had an incredible faith in technology. They just thought if you just let markets do their thing, people will develop the technologies that will solve the problem. And you can still find people saying this today, people like Steve Koonin and quite a few others. So we thought we would write a book about the history of technology to make the point that if you look at the history of technology, especially in the 20th century, the big transformative technological innovations, none of them, not one, was a product of free markets just doing their own thing. All of them involved a very strong government role. So we started collecting data information for that. We hired a research assistant and we wrote a couple of proposals, but I don't know, somehow, it felt like the whole argument could be made in 3 pages. And we didn't feel that motivated to write 300 pages about something that seemed almost in a way too obvious. And then Mariana Mazzucato wrote her book, The Entrepreneurial State. And you might have thought we'd be disappointed because sometimes if you have an idea for a book and someone else does it first, you feel sad, you feel scooped. But I didn't. I felt this giant sense of relief. I thought, oh, that's fantastic. She wrote that book, now we don't have to. And so that was a good sign that we didn't really want to write the technology book. And it was after that that we realized, what we really wanted to write about was the ideology. Why do these people subscribe to this ideology of market fundamentalism when there's so much evidence to suggest that it's just not true? And so that became the project. And once we realized that was the project, then we got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and then it still took time to write the book, but then we were on our way.
I was struck by, I'm struck by so many things in the book, and every day something else, sticks out. But that a young person had a greater chance of dying working on the railroad than fighting in the war, that our cultural problems were or are constructed is something that I'm wrestling with every night. And of course, you talk about the Chicago School of Economics, which many people have talked about, but I think you brought more clarity to the impact that it had.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and a large part of the book is to try to pull together things that are not necessarily brand new discoveries, but to try to show how these different things worked together to lead us to where we are today. And so we start the book with a discussion about child labor and workplace injury in the early 20th century, because I think that a lot of people have forgotten, or maybe never really knew, how absolutely brutal unregulated capitalism was in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in the United States, the progressive movement was essentially a response to the failures and brutality of poorly or unregulated capitalism. And so people who have this ideal of the free market have forgotten or denied this history. And so part of what we do in the beginning of the book is to recover this history and to point out that children as young as 2 years old worked in textile mills in Massachusetts. It was routine for children 6, 8, 10, or 12 years to work in mines, mills, and factories. And workplaces were incredibly dangerous. 1 in 1,000 American workers was killed on the job every year, which is the statistical equivalent of if 1.5 million were being killed every day now. So that would be like a COVID pandemic of workplace injury every single year. And in fact, in the early 20th century, people talked about it as an epidemic of workplace injury and death. So the point of having this conversation is twofold. One is to remind people of how bad capitalism can be when it's left to its own devices, and that the rules and regulations and laws that were then passed in the 19aughts, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond were to address these failures, to address these market failures, to make workplaces safer, to limit working hours, to protect workers from workplace injury, and also other things, to protect competition against monopolistic practices, to protect depositors from corrupt and ill-managed banks. I mean, a whole set of issues that where the limits of free market capitalism had been recognized and addressed. But this whole history has been effaced in part because of the Chicago School. So what we show in the book then is that a whole set of laws were put in place, particularly in the 1930s during the New Deal, to address some of these failures. And there is the statistic you quote on the workplace safety. The workplace was so dangerous in America that a 15-year-old boy in 1914 would have been safer going to fight in World War I than going to work on the railroads.
It's just amazing.
Astonishing statistic, I know. So fast forward, a lot of laws are put in place to fix these problems, and that includes the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which after 3 decades of debate places limits on child labor and limits on working hours and sets a minimum wage. But the forces of the ideology of market fundamentalism fight back. And they'd been fighting back all along, but they hadn't really been very successful. For the most part, they had lost those battles. We did pass laws to protect workers, to limit child labor. But after World War II, they regroup and they say, okay, we need to try again. Our arguments are not working, in part because people see that they're self-serving and hypocritical. If business leaders say, oh, just trust business leaders to run things, well, most Americans would say, yeah, that doesn't really pass the laugh test. But if we could recruit academics to say it, and particularly if we can link the argument to something Americans cherish, then we can make the argument more persuasive. And so they do 2 things. They come up with this idea of linking business freedom to political freedom. And this begins in 1939 with the National Association of Manufacturers and a campaign they ran called the Tripod of Freedom. And the argument was that American freedom was founded, or the American way of life was founded on 3 things: representative democracy, we all agree with that, the rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. We all agree with that. And here was the extra piece, free enterprise. By arguing it was a tripod, the claim was if compromised free enterprise, for example, with a law about minimum wages or maximum working hours, you threaten political freedom and you threaten democracy. And so they begin to build that argument in the late 1930s in order to make it seem like it's not just self-serving, but that it's actually in the interest of all Americans. And then in the 1940s, they actively look for academics to help them make the argument. And they find two key people who they then bring to America. And these are the Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, both Austrian, both generally considered to be among the founders of neoliberalism. And it turns out that on their own accord, von Hayek and von Mises had been making a similar argument in Europe that compromises to economic freedom, centralized planning, put you on the road to serfdom, as Hayek put it. So they recruit these folks to come to the United States. And, we point out in the book, there's lots and lots of ironies in the book. And one of my famous ironies is these business leaders are constantly criticizing socialism and communism as foreign theories. And they accuse American labor unions of being contaminated by foreign thinking because of their socialistic orientations. But they are actually literally importing foreign theorists to America. So they arranged for von Mises to be hired at New York University, and they arranged for von Hayek to be hired at the Chicago School. They pay for his salary, they create a position, they do not advertise it, so this is all done behind closed doors. So that's irony number two. These champions of competition and free markets do not believe in competition when it comes to hiring the academics that they want to carry their water. So they hire von Hayek at Chicago, but then they realize it's not enough just to have one guy, you need to build a school. And so these business leaders fund a project at the University of Chicago called the Free Market Project. And its specific purpose is to develop the academic arguments to support the idea that the free market should be the foundation of American society, and that the free market is the foundation of a free society. And that becomes the life work of a group of famous Chicago economists, Aaron Director, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and very interestingly, something I didn't know before we started this book, the jurist Robert Bork.
There's just so much in there. How are you holding up? I mean, I know you're having this conversation a lot and going over much of the same material, how it's all sitting with you these days.
Now that it's done, and as you said, I've had the opportunity to talk to people about it, thinking about it, I'm exhausted because as you say, it is a very big book. Now that it's done, I appreciate how ambitious a book it is. I think that one of my strengths in life is sometimes I don't think about how big a task is when I take it on, because if I did, I probably wouldn't do it. I've been to Everest Base Camp and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and the way you climb a mountain is one step at a time, and the way you write a book is one page at a time. So I think while we were doing it, in a way, we were sort of in self-denial about how ambitious the book really is. So now that it's done, I can look back and say, wow, that's a really ambitious project. And I think considering the ambition of the book, I think we've done a pretty good job, and I'm proud of what we've done. It's a tricky book. Some people are resistant to the message, but that, of course, we knew would happen because we're asking people to rethink things that they've believed for a long time were true. And so asking people to rethink it it's asking a lot. And I recognize that. And that's partly why the book is long, because we realized that if we wanted to make the case that this myth had been constructed, that had been consciously and deliberately developed by key business leaders over the course of the 20th century, we couldn't just say that. We'd have to make the argument and really provide compelling evidence. And so part of the reason why the book is long is because we're trying to really show, we're not just, it's the old show, don't tell. And so that's why I always tell people, you really don't have to read the whole book. It's important for the whole book to be there to make the case, but many of these chapters stand on their own. So if you're just interested in the Chicago School, or you're just interested in popular culture, you can read those sections. And I do think, having gone back now and reread some of those parts of the book, I do think they stand on their own. So that makes me happy, because I realize that asking people to read a 550-page book, especially nowadays, people's attention spans are shorter than they were when we wrote Merchants of Doubt. Big books are becoming rarer and rarer. So I'm also super grateful to our publisher that they had the faith in this project to be willing to publish this big book.
Well, it's a great book. It's, I view it as a course. So
Thank you.
thank you. I have a couple of thoughts that I'm noodling with. The question I think is, can you talk about the social cost of capitalism? How did we get here and where are we going, especially with the extremist on the right? And, I can hear Jason Moore talking about zombie capitalism. I can hear Chris Hedges and Michael Ignatieff talking about whether we should burn it down or not. What does radical democracy look like? When you put all those things together, what do you come up with?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, we don't have the answer to that. And we knew that if we tried to answer it at the end of the book, any answer we would try to give would be inadequate and it would undermine the power of the previous 500 pages. So, part of what we're trying to do in the book is to join that conversation and to encourage people to think about the idea that, there's a way in which people in my field talk about naturalization, right? That advocates of particular standpoints have often tried to claim that the way the world is natural. And often they've invoked natural science to defend it. So, for example, the advocates of racial inequality in the 19th and early 20th centuries argued that Black people were racially inferior and that was genetic, right? So they naturalized their racism and projected it onto nature. I think we see something similar with capitalism, that the cheerleaders of capitalism want us to believe that capitalism is natural. They want us to believe that it's how the world works, like in the same way that the laws of physics tell us how the world works. But the difference is it's not true, because it's not a physical system, it's a social system. And social systems are built by people. Like, we can argue whether scientific theories are socially constructed, but there's no question that social systems are socially constructed, right? That's non-controversial. So then the question is, well, why have we constructed them this way? And sometimes we've constructed systems in a certain way because they actually work well. And, we tried things and they worked. And so we did those. But in other cases, we tried them and they didn't work, but we didn't know how to change them, or we weren't willing to change them, or we couldn't see what the alternative was, or we were bombarded by messages telling us that there was no alternative. And so our book is about that last piece, right? What we argue is that part of the reason why so many people believe in the power of markets is because we have been bombarded by that message for a century. And in the book, we show textbooks, radio, television, film, academia, politics, and we have chapters, religion, we have chapters on all these things. And it's kind of an astonishing story to see how much we have been propagandized this message. So when you understand that, then it's kind of no surprise that so many of us have bought the message, because it's been sold to us in so many formats. In a way, it actually shows how bad the failures of capitalism are today, that despite this massive propagandizing, a lot of us are saying, well, yeah, but climate change, the opioid crisis, declining, health disparities, declining lifespan. I mean, the failures of capitalism are now, I think, so conspicuous that it's almost as if we're in a moment that now recapitulates what people experienced in the early 20th century. And that's why I think the book is powerful, beginning with those debates from the early 20th century, because I think many of us living today can see, history doesn't repeat itself. So what we're facing today is not the same as what people faced, in 1900, but many of the kinds of problems we face, the social costs of capitalism, the failures of capitalism, are similar. And so we can see that we've bought this story, we've been sold a bill of goods, and now we can see that it is a bill of goods, and we can ask ourselves, well, hold on, what did people do in the past to remedy these problems, and what can we do now? And the remedies today may not be the same as what they were in the 1920s and 30s, but the point is to know that there are remedies, there are alternatives. And for me, the most powerful part of the book, the line that I wrote that I keep coming back to, is there's a place in the book where we discuss Margaret Thatcher. At one point, we had the ambition to talk about Britain too, and then we realized, no, this is a big enough challenge just talking about the United States, but we have to at least mention Margaret Thatcher because she plays such an important role in pushing these ideas in Britain. And she and Ronald Reagan are so simpatico. So she has this famous line, she called it the Tina doctrine, there is no alternative. Ronald Reagan famously said the scariest words in the English language were, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. But I think the scariest words are, there's no alternative. Because that's terrifying because it's telling us we have no choice. It's stripping us of agency. And so what we say in the book is there are always alternatives. And part of the challenge of scholars, public intellectuals, citizen activists, ordinary people is to figure out what those alternatives are and then to figure out how to implement them. And that's where I think we are right now. I think lots and lots of people know, both on the right and on the left. I think some of the division we experience is that we all know that things have gone badly. I think that's something that actually the right and the left agree with. The problem is we disagree about what has gone badly, and therefore we disagree about what the remedies could be.
This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. My name is Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Naomi Oreskes. We're mostly talking about The Big Myth, her latest book with Eric Conway, and I'm trying to work in some of my research questions because The Big Myth really explains why we're so polarized and why we're having such a hard time finding common ground or navigating difficult conversations. Stephen Sondheim was an American composer and lyricist. In an interview with D.T. Max in The New Yorker, he said, "My idea is that every moment of human intercourse, like right now between you and me, there are 64 of you in this room and 64 of me in this room that we bring into a conversation. So every sentence we say, any intercourse we have is filled with layers." So I'm curious how that resonates with you, especially in light of how deep and how layered The Big Myth is. And I wonder if you can unpack what you think he's saying and how it relates to the complexities of The Big Myth.
Got it. I see. So he's really asking about the multiplicity of our own perspectives and orientations. Yeah. Well, that's certainly true. And it's certainly true that, on a different day of the week, I might stress or emphasize different elements in the book. And depending on what's happened in the world, like the last few weeks, I've been finding myself more willing to use the word evil than I probably have until now. The word darkness has been in the forefront of my mind a lot. So I do think, we respond to situations both based on our accumulated experience, observations, but also what's happening around us in any given moment. And certain messages will feel more important, also more difficult, more delicate in any given moment. So I don't think of it as like multiple personalities, but I don't think that's what Sondheim meant. But it is true that we all have multiplicities of perspective, and that's a good thing because that's where there's the opportunity for connection, right? Because I might have a variety of ways of thinking about a problem, and maybe some of those ways don't resonate with you, but others do. And that's, of course, part of the art of teaching. When you have a classroom of students, you know that not all the students will respond to a particular presentation of material. So sometimes you experiment with different approaches or different ways of presenting the material in order, ideally, to reach everyone in the room.
We all have different ways of learning.
Right, that too.
Right. Is racism and prejudice innate, or is it learned through the many discussions in everyday life, such as family talk, all forms of media, books, and so on? And how can you connect that to The Big Myth?
Well, that's the classic nature-nurture question, which people have been arguing about for 150 years. So we're clearly not going to resolve that today. But I think that whenever there's been a debate, as a historian, I would say, whenever you see a debate that just won't go away, to me, that's telling you that the answer is both end. That both sides, there's a famous line from John Stuart Mill where he says both sides are right in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny. So I think I think the scientific evidence is clear that there is a substantive genetic component to who we are, to our personalities, including things like intelligence, musical talent, athletic ability. But we also know that there's a giant cultural component as well. You could be born the greatest athlete in the world, but if you were born into a family with no money to give you tennis lessons or no tennis courts near where you live, or no knowledge of tennis or no instruction in tennis, that innate ability will probably just atrophy. There's a beautiful essay that was written years ago by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, where it's called Mozart Assassiné. And it's a picture of an immigrant child on a train where he imagines this child is Mozart. But instead of being born into a musical family, as Mozart was, with a very musical father who cultivated his musical ability, instead, he's a poor immigrant child with no opportunity to develop his talent. So I think we know it's both. And I think that's partly why the arguments for the culture part are so important, because the point of culture, the point of education, the point of equal opportunity is not to say that we're all the same. We know that we're not. but it's to say that we all deserve the same opportunity to develop our skills and talents, and that society benefits when each of us can maximize our skills and talents. And for me, that's the important lesson of, the whole last 150 years of history. And it connects to the book because there is a place in the book where this issue comes up. So in general, the book is not about racism, but there is a racist component to the debates that take place in the 1920s over questions about workplace equity and minimum wage laws and unionization and collective bargaining. So there was a very interesting speech that I found in the archives. A man named Noel Sargent, who was the secretary of the National Association of Manufacturers. NAM was arguing that these questions about minimum wage, maximum working hours should be the prerogative of the owner of the factory. That is, the owner of the factory, it was his right to decide, what salary he was offering his workers, what conditions, what hours, all the rest. But of course, many people disagreed with that. And many people thought, no, there should be minimum wage laws. A company should not be able to exploit its workers, indefinitely. So Sargent writes this essay where he says, well, what is the argument here, really? What is the argument for capitalism as opposed to for socialism? And he says, fundamentally, the argument for capitalism is that people are unequal, that people are born unequal. And therefore, it's right that some people should be rich and some people should be poor, right? And in this particular discussion, he cites some famous American eugenicists. So that's kind of a tell, right? That's a giveaway that there's this racist eugenic component that is infiltrating into this thinking and being mobilized as an argument to justify these brutal workplace practices that keep workers in their place. And so there you definitely see there's a racial component and an anti-immigrant component. And of course, this is taking place in the 1920s, which is the same period of time when immigration laws are being revised in America to keep out immigrants who are viewed as being racially and genetically inferior, particularly immigrants from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and China.
One of the questions I had to ask you, but you've already answered it, was how has your research work contributed to our understanding of power, ideology, and social inequality? And the whole book.
Yeah. From page 1 to page 547. I mean, that's what the book is about. Yeah.
No, it's all there. What do you think has to happen to business schools at universities?
Oh, yeah. Business schools are a big thing. It's interesting you ask. So we don't write a lot about book, although we do have a section where we talk about a propaganda campaign from the early 1920s that was run by the National Electric Light Association, a trade group representing the electricity industry, in which they tried to shape and influence business school curricula, along with curricula in college economics and business courses, to be more pro-capitalist, more free market, less sympathetic to unions and regulation. And so that is a significant part of the story, the way business schools were aligned with American business. And it's interesting you ask about that because I've just recently joined at Harvard, at the Harvard Business School. There's a really great group of faculty who run a business history seminar, and really interesting scholars who are looking at the history of business, including the history of business schools. And I think that's a really rich area for understanding how these, let's just call them lopsided views of business practice, have really been propagated in the United States. And I'm happy to say that there are colleagues at Harvard and other business schools who are opening up a space to have that conversation, especially to think harder about sustainable capitalism. Like, are there ways that we can make capitalism function in ways that don't destroy the planet, don't kill people, don't saturate us with toxic chemicals? And I think that's a crucial conversation, because if we can't figure out how to do that, then we really do need to overthrow capitalism. But that's a pretty daunting proposition. So it seems to me it would be better if we could fix capitalism. And so I'm glad that there are people in business schools who are having that conversation.
I hope you're right. I mean, I hope we can fix it, because what we don't know is what's next.
Correct. And revolutions often don't go the way the revolutionaries want them to.
No, and there's too many examples where the revolution's gone in the wrong direction.
Yeah. I mean, the book, we also, just one other quick thing on that. I'm a great fan of Emanuel Wallerstein because he's really, really great on this issue. And one of the things he says, one of the challenges of thinking through these kinds of questions is if you look at the history of revolutions, you see that they often go badly. and they don't produce the outcomes people want. And so conservatives then use this to counsel caution, gradualism, say, well, we need to do this gradually, we need to take our time. But the problem with that is it's essentially asking the people who are suffering to just accept their suffering, because it's a kind of a promissory note that has no limit to it. And so how do you find that middle ground, that balance, where you say, no, it's not okay to just tell the oppressed that they have to stay oppressed, but also figure out how to make meaningful social change? And that's really the question we face today, I think.
So if I can ask you one last question, what practical interventions, strategies, or tools can be developed or implemented to facilitate more effective and constructive conversations as a result of reading The Big Myth? What do you hope to unlock?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things I've been thinking about talking about the book is about how we conceptualize ourselves. So if you go back to the early 20th century, many people thought of themselves as workers. In the mid 20th century, that shifted and many people began to think of themselves as consumers. I think one thing that we need to reclaim is our image of ourselves as citizens, because we may or may not all be consumers, we may or may not all be workers, but we're all citizens and we all have both rights and obligations as citizens. And I think if we could reclaim a stronger sense of citizenship, then it could also help us to think through, how do citizens have conversations? So I live in New England, where we have the time-honored, protocol of town meeting. Now, it's really easy to romanticize town meeting, and anyone who's lived in New England will tell you, no, you do not want to romanticize town meeting. Town meetings are frustrating, they're long, they're boring, they're vexing. People talk too much. People don't know how to say what they need to say and sit down. There are lots and lots of problems with town meeting. But the one thing that is incredibly great about town meeting is that at least once a year, you sit down with your fellow citizens of your town and you talk and you listen. And people really do listen. And that's always the thing that I've always been so impressed about at our town meeting. And we do have a great town moderator, so we're very lucky that way. But people do listen and people respond. And so that is a model for reminding us that we're all part of communities and we all do live together, whether we like it or not. And so life is going to go better if we can figure out ways to talk and to listen and to live together. And so I wouldn't say that everyone in the world should necessarily adopt the New England town meeting model, but something like that, some kind of, revived Chautauqua movement, something that would find more ways to bring us together to have conversations. And obviously it won't be easy. And obviously there will be people, I have friends, women, people of color, who are not going to sit down with people who have sent them death threats. So I'm not calling for that. I'm not being naive about what some of the real challenges are. But I do think that having these conversations, talking and listening, and especially the listening piece, is really, really important.
I couldn't agree more. Naomi, I really want to thank you for taking time to join us. I love the new book. It's an incredible body of work, and it will take a few reads. So I'm very grateful for your time. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, and good luck with your work. I hope you finish your PhD soon.
I appreciate your help. Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
We've been talking with Naomi Oreskes about her work and her newest book that she wrote with Eric Conway, The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. It's available at your favorite bookstore and online. You can learn more about Naomi's work at Harvard University and almost everywhere on the internet. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is part of my dissertation research project with the University of British Columbia. It's also a radio program and podcast available on campus and community radio stations across Canada. It's produced at the Conversation Lab in Vancouver's downtown Eastside on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Thanks to my supervisory committee, Drs. Manel Matani, Janice Stewart, Denise Ferrara de Silva, Jan Fook, and Andy Hoffman. My cohort at UBC's Social Justice Institute, friends and family who support this passion project, and Jason Shaw, who composed the music for us. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.